The golden autumn leaves danced in the wind as Satya knelt beside the sacred stream, her hands trembling as she placed wild flower petals in the flowing water. The gentle sound of the current mingled with her whispers, directed to the great wolf spirit, guardian of lonely hearts according to the ancient traditions of her Cherokee people. At 22 winters, she remained without a companion, rejecting suitors her father deemed suitable, but who left her heart as cold as the stones in the riverbed. The young woman raised her eyes to the Appalachian Mountains, rising majestically on the horizon, their slopes covered by a tapestry of autumn colors that reflected the melancholy dwelling in her soul. Her black hair, braided with red-dyed cotton ribbons, swayed gently as she closed her eyes and allowed her prayer to spring from the deepest part of her being. The wind carried the scent of cedar and moist earth, elements that always connected her to the ancestral spirits of her tribe. Words flowed from her lips like wild honey, asking the wolf spirit to bring someone capable of awakening the passion dormant in her chest, someone whose eyes could see beyond the conventions and traditions that seemed to imprison her restless heart. She knew her request was dangerous, for spirits did not always respond in ways mortals expected. Her hands closed into fists over her chest, feeling her heart's quickened beats as she formed her deepest desire. When she finally stood, a strange sense of expectation took hold of Satya, as if the very air around her had changed in density. The stream's waters seemed to murmur ancient secrets as they carried her petal offerings downstream, disappearing between the moss-covered stones. She did not know that at that exact moment, 3 days' walk away, a young Creek warrior named Hakan rode toward her village, carrying a peace proposal that would forever change both their destinies. The sun began its descent behind the mountains when Satya returned to the village, her soft leather sandals making little noise on the beaten earth of familiar paths. Fires were already being lit for the communal dinner, and children's voices at play echoed among the traditional wooden and clay houses. She breathed deeply, the aroma of roasted corn and smoked meat, trying to push away the uneasiness that had grown in her chest since making her prayer to the wolf spirit. 3 days later, the sun had barely risen when warning drums echoed through the Cherokee village, announcing the arrival of visitors. Satya, who was sifting corn beside her mother Atsadi, felt a shiver run down her spine upon hearing the specific rhythm that indicated the approach of a delegation from another tribe. Her hands paused over the wicker basket, and her eyes instinctively turned to the trail that wound through the oak forest, where a small procession emerged from among the trees with the solemn dignity of peace emissaries. At the front of the group rode a man who immediately captured her attention, not only for his proud posture on the painted horse, but for the way his eyes surveyed the village with a mixture of caution and respect. Hakan was an imposing Creek warrior, with black hair braided with eagle feathers and a face marked by scars that told stories of battles and honor. His traditional garments, decorated with beads and embroidery that Satya recognized as typical of his rival people, gleamed under the morning light as he dismounted, with the grace of an experienced predator. The young emissary carried with him a ceremonial staff adorned with peace symbols, and when his eyes met Satya's across the crowd gathering to receive the visitors, she felt as if lightning had pierced her chest. There was something in the intensity of that gaze that awakened a spark long dormant within her, an inexplicable connection that immediately reminded her of her prayer by the sacred stream. Time seemed to dissolve around them, and for an instant suspended in the morning air, only their hearts existed, beating in unison. Hakan inclined his head slightly toward her, an almost imperceptible gesture that did not escape Satya's attentive eyes, before turning respectfully to Chief Amadahi, who approached accompanied by the tribe's elders. Formal words of greeting echoed across the central plaza, but Satya could barely concentrate on the diplomatic protocol, for her eyes continued to be drawn to the majestic figure of the Creek warrior. Every movement he made seemed charged with an energy that resonated with something deep in her soul, as if she recognized in him a part of herself she had long sought. While the welcoming ceremony proceeded with the traditional tobacco offering and ritual words of hospitality, Satya noticed that Hakan also struggled to keep his attention focused on the formalities, his eyes discreetly drifting in her direction whenever possible. The young Cherokee woman felt her cheeks blush under the weight of those glances, an unfamiliar yet somehow familiar sensation, as if she were rediscovering a part of herself that had remained hidden until that moment. The autumn wind brought with it the aroma of fires and the nearby river, but for Satya, all that existed in that moment was the growing awareness that her prayer had been heard in a way she could never have imagined. During the days following the peace negotiations, Hakan remained in the Cherokee village as an honored guest, lodged in the ceremonial house reserved for important visitors. Satya found herself constantly seeking excuses to pass near the place where he stayed, pretending to search for medicinal herbs in the nearby forest or carry water from the stream that ran beside the building. Their casual encounters gradually became less accidental, and she began to notice how he too seemed to adjust his paths to cross with hers, always maintaining the respectful distance required by tribal customs. One afternoon, while collecting ginseng roots at the edge of the woods, Satya noticed that Hakan was watching her from afar, leaning against an ancient oak trunk, his arms crossed over his broad chest, covered by the traditional Creek tunic. When their gazes met, he did not look away as he had on previous occasions, but maintained eye contact with an intensity that made her heart race dangerously. Slowly, he approached, his steps cautious on the dry leaves that carpeted the forest floor, until only a few meters separated them. The silence between them was charged with a tension that seemed to electrify the very air, a wordless communication that transcended the cultural and linguistic barriers that theoretically separated them. Hakan slowly extended one of his hands, and Satya, as if in a trance, allowed him to delicately touch a strand of her hair that had escaped from her braid, feeling a shiver run through her entire body at that gentle contact. His fingers were rough from work and battles, but his touch had the delicacy of one who understands the value of fragile and precious things. They remained like this for a moment that seemed to extend through eternity, breathing the same air perfumed by wild flowers and the moist autumn earth, while their hearts beat a rhythm that seemed to echo the very pulse of nature around them. Satya closed her eyes and allowed herself to fully feel that inexplicable connection, remembering her prayer to the wolf spirit, and understanding that perhaps the spirits had a wisdom greater than she could have imagined. When she finally opened her eyes, she found in his a depth of emotion that confirmed this attraction was mutual and equally overwhelming. The distant sound of voices coming from the village made them quickly move apart, reminding them of the complex reality that surrounded them and the dangerous implications of this growing attraction. Hakan stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, but his eyes remained fixed on hers with a silent promise that this moment would not be forgotten. Satya quickly gathered her herbs and moved away toward the village, her heart still racing and her mind spinning, with the understanding that she had crossed an invisible line from which there might be no return, especially considering he was a warrior from a tribe that, despite recent peace agreements, still carried centuries of rivalry with her people. The following nights brought an uneasiness that kept Satya awake on her straw mat, staring at the stars through the smoke opening in her family home's roof. Her mind endlessly replayed every detail of the forest encounter, the texture of Hakan's skin, the warmth of his touch, and the intensity of his dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets as deep as the sacred mountain caves. She knew she was walking on dangerous ground, not only because of the political aspects of becoming involved with a Creek, but also because of the overwhelming intensity of the feelings blooming in her chest like wildflowers after a storm. During the day, she tried to maintain her normal routine, helping prepare communal meals, weaving baskets with her mother, and participating in the feminine rituals of her tribe, but her thoughts constantly drifted to the visiting warrior. She discreetly observed during communal meals how Hakan interacted with dignity and respect with the Cherokee men, perceiving in him a natural nobility that transcended tribal boundaries. There were moments when he told stories of his homeland, and she lost herself in the sound of his deep, melodious voice, imagining the landscapes he described with such passion. One morning, while carrying water jugs from the stream to the village, Satya almost dropped her load upon finding Hakan waiting for her on the path, his eyes revealing the same uneasiness she felt. He gently held one of the jugs, relieving the weight of her burden, and they walked side by side in silence, each step synchronized as if it were an ancient dance. The proximity of their bodies created an almost palpable tension, and Satya could feel the warmth emanating from him, even through the garments that separated them. When they reached the village outskirts, Hakan stopped abruptly and turned to her, his eyes charged with an urgency that made her heart race. Without saying a word, he gently touched her face with the back of his hand, a gesture so intimate and tender that Satya felt her legs weaken. In that moment, she understood she was hopelessly in love with this man who should be her natural enemy, and by the expression in his eyes, she knew he felt the same for her. The reality of their situation struck her like lightning. She had fallen in love with the man sent by the spirits in response to her prayer, but he belonged to a world that her people's traditions considered forbidden. The sound of approaching footsteps made them quickly separate, but not before Hakan whispered her name for the first time, pronouncing each syllable with a reverence that made her name sound like a prayer. Satya gathered her jugs and ran toward the village, her heart beating erratically, and her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening between them. She knew she needed to make a decision, either find a way to follow her heart or find strength to pull away before they were both consumed by a love that could destroy not only their own lives, but also compromise the fragile peace between their peoples. The decision came unexpectedly when Satya learned that negotiations were coming to an end and that Hakan would depart the next day, taking with him the newly signed peace treaty. The news struck her like an arrow to the chest, making her understand that the moment had come to act, or forever lose the opportunity to explore this love that had bloomed so intensely and unexpectedly. That night, when the village slept under the starry mantle and only the night guards kept watch, she wrapped herself in her darkest cloak and silently slipped through the shadows to the ceremonial house where Hakan was staying. She found him sitting outside the building, gazing at the stars with a melancholic expression that perfectly mirrored her own feelings. Upon noticing her approach, he slowly stood, and when she emerged from the shadows, their eyes met with an intensity that made any need for words unnecessary. He extended his hand to her, and when Satya took it, she felt as if she were crossing not only the physical space that separated them, but also all the cultural and social barriers that tried to keep them apart. They walked in silence to a secret clearing that Satya had known since childhood, a sacred place where ancient trees formed a natural circle under the silvery light of the full moon. There, far from curious eyes and social conventions, they could finally surrender to the passion that had grown between them like a natural and irresistible force. Hakan touched her face with a reverence that made her feel like the most precious woman on earth, and when their lips finally met, it was as if two souls long separated were reuniting in perfect harmony. That night became a symphony of discoveries, each touch and each kiss revealing new dimensions of the love that had bloomed between them. Under the ancestral stars that had witnessed the birth of their peoples, Satya and Hakan created their own tradition, a union ritual that transcended tribal boundaries and spoke directly to hearts that had found their other half. She caressed the scars on his chest, each mark telling a story of survival and honor, while he delicately traced the contours of her face as if memorizing every detail to carry with him forever. When dawn began to tinge the sky with golden tones, both knew this would be simultaneously the first and last night they would spend together. Hakan held Satya's face between his hands and gazed into her eyes with an intensity that engraved that moment in her soul for all eternity. She saw reflected in his eyes the same pain she felt in her own heart, the knowledge that they had found true and deep love at the moment they needed to separate. When they finally parted, both carried with them the indelible mark of that love that had flourished against all odds, but now needed to be kept as a secret treasure in their hearts. Hakan's departure the following morning was a moment of silent agony for Satya, who watched from afar the farewell ceremony while maintaining a serene expression that hid the devastating storm within her. She remained among the tribe's women, weaving a basket that her trembling hands could barely control, while her eyes followed every movement of the Creek warrior who had become master of her heart. When he mounted his horse and turned one last time toward the village, their gazes crossed for an eternal instant, a silent communication charged with mute promises and unspoken farewells. The days that followed transformed into a monotonous succession of routine activities that Satya performed like a person in a dream state, her body present, but her soul wandering through memories of that magical night in the clearing. Her mother, Atsadi, began to notice the changes in her daughter, the way she constantly gazed at the trail leading to Creek territory, and how her eyes had acquired a deep melancholy that hadn't existed before the peace delegation's visit. Maternal attempts to discover what afflicted Satya were met with forced smiles and evasive excuses about seasonal changes and natural cycles. 3 weeks after Hakan's departure, Satya discovered she carried in her womb the fruit of that single night of love. The discovery struck her like lightning in a clear sky, filling her simultaneously with deep joy and paralyzing terror as she understood the devastating implications this pregnancy would have on her life and the newly achieved political stability between the tribes. She spent hours sitting by the sacred stream where she had made her initial prayer, her hands instinctively protecting her still imperceptible belly while trying to process the magnitude of the situation she found herself in. The young Cherokee woman knew she could not hide her condition for long, and that eventually she would have to face her father's wrath, her mother's disappointment, and the possible rejection of her entire tribe. More importantly, she knew this child would be seen as a living symbol of betrayal to ancestral traditions and could put at risk the peace treaty so carefully negotiated. However, when she placed her hands on her belly and thought of the life growing within her, a life conceived in the purest love she had experienced, she felt a maternal strength surge in her chest, a fierce determination to protect this child no matter what the consequences. During the long sleepless nights that followed, Satya devised desperate plans to reunite with Hakan, imagining impossible scenarios where they could live together with their child, far from tribal prejudices and rivalries. She even considered fleeing alone to give birth in neutral territory, raising the child away from both tribes. But the practical reality of these fantasies always proved cruel and impractical. Her only certainty was that she could not deny the existence of that love that had generated new life, even if it meant facing alone the consequences of her choice to follow her heart instead of social conventions. The revelation of Satya's pregnancy spread through the Cherokee village like fire in dry straw, generating shockwaves that shook the deepest social structures of the community. Her father, the respected hunter Sequoia, entered a state of devastating fury that alternated between periods of sepulchral silence and explosions of rage that made the wooden walls of his house tremble. Atsadi, her mother, wept silently while trying to understand how her obedient daughter had transformed into a source of family dishonor, her eyes reflecting a deep pain that went beyond personal disappointment and reached fear of the political consequences that could arise from the situation. The tribal council convened in emergency session to decide Satya's fate, and heated discussions echoed through the ceremonial house for 3 consecutive days. Some elders advocated immediate banishment as a way to preserve the tribe's honor and avoid conflicts with the Creek, while others argued that the young woman had been bewitched or manipulated, deserving compassion instead of punishment. Chief Amadahi, known for his wisdom and moderation, maintained thoughtful silence while listening to all arguments, knowing his final decision would have ramifications extending far beyond Satya's individual destiny. During this period of uncertainty, Satya remained confined to her family home, forbidden from moving freely through the village while her situation was deliberated. She spent days sewing tiny clothes for the child growing in her womb, each stitch a silent prayer for her child's safety and future. Her hands worked automatically, while her mind wandered through memories of Hakan, imagining how he would react to learning of the child's existence and whether there would be any possibility of reuniting, even if it meant facing hostility from both tribes. The council's final decision came like a sentence that would forever change the course of her life. Satya would be sent to live with a distant aunt in a remote Cherokee village in the northern mountains, where she would give birth away from curious eyes and political tensions. The child would be raised as an orphan of unknown father, and Satya could never reveal the progenitor's true identity under penalty of permanent banishment. It was a solution that tried to balance compassion for the young mother with the need to preserve tribal stability, but condemned both Satya and her child to a life of secrets and half-truths. On the night before her departure, Satya silently escaped from home one last time to visit the sacred stream where it all began. She knelt in the same place where she had prayed to the wolf spirit months before. But this time her words were of gratitude instead of supplication. She thanked for the days of true love she had experienced, for the child growing in her womb as tangible proof of that love, and for the inner strength she had discovered to face the consequences of her choices. When she rose for the last time from that sacred place, she carried with her the certainty that, regardless of what the future held, she had known a love that transcended all human barriers and that no tribal decision could erase from her soul. 5 years had passed since Satya left her natal village, and life in the remote northern mountains had become a melancholic routine punctuated only by the pure joy she found in her son, Yansa, whose dark eyes carried the same intensity she remembered in Hakan's gaze. The child had grown strong and curious, exploring the mountainous woods with a natural courage that filled Satya's heart with pride and simultaneously tightened it with longing for the father he had never known. Aunt Inala, a gentle widow who had welcomed her without asking questions, watched with silent wisdom how Satya raised the boy with a fierce and protective love that compensated for the paternal absence. During these years of voluntary exile, Satya had transformed into a different woman from that dreamy young girl who had prayed by the sacred stream. Her beauty had acquired a melancholic depth, and her eyes carried the wisdom of those who learned to find joy in small moments while carrying great losses in their hearts. She taught Yansa Cherokee traditions, told him stories of ancestors, and watched with a mixture of joy and pain how he absorbed each lesson with a lively intelligence that reminded her of both herself and the distant father. One spring afternoon, while Yansa played in the clearing near the house, Satya heard the sound of horse hooves approaching along the mountain trail. Her heart raced when she recognized the familiar silhouette emerging from among the trees. Hakan had found his way to her, his hair now touched by silver strands, but his eyes maintaining the same intensity that had awakened her love years before. He dismounted slowly, and when their gazes met, it was as if the 5 years of separation dissolved in an instant, leaving only the deep and unchanged love that had flourished between them that magical night under the stars. Yansa, curious about the visitor, approached his mother, and Hakan stood motionless upon perceiving in the boy's features an unmistakable combination of his own characteristics with Satya's. His eyes filled with tears as he understood he had missed the first years of his son's life, but also lit up with deep joy upon discovering that his love had generated such a perfect life. Satya held Yansa's hand and, for the first time in 5 years, pronounced the name she had kept as a secret treasure in her heart, introducing father and son in an intimate ceremony that no tribal ritual could make more sacred. The three spent the following days creating memories that would have to last a lifetime, for Hakan explained he had come not only to meet his son, but also to say goodbye. His tribe was preparing to migrate west, following Other Creek in search of lands free from white settler pressure, and he had risked everything to have these few days with the family he had created through his forbidden love. On the last night, while Yansa slept, Satya and Hakan sat under the same stars that had witnessed their first encounter, knowing they would bid farewell again, but this time carrying the certainty that their love had created something eternal in the form of their son. When he departed the next morning, Satya knew that Yansa would grow up knowing the story of his parents, a love that defied boundaries, survived separation, and left as legacy a child who would carry in his veins the impossible union of two worlds that had found harmony in the hearts of two people, brave enough to follow the paths of the heart, even when those paths led through forbidden and dangerous territories. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.